Now, here's the setting. 2 days ago, two strangers, Josh and Miles, found themselves stranded in the wilderness together. Yesterday, Miles and Josh set out to find their way home. Trying to get to higher ground, they decided to climb up and out of the canyon. While doing so, Miles slipped, fell, and hit his arm pretty hard on some rocks. While tending to the injury, Miles expressed frustration with the brokenness he sees in the world. Josh shared with Miles about how brokenness started with Adam and Eve and was passed down from there. He told him how things got increasingly evil to the point where God thought about wiping out his creation. But in the end, God found hope in a man named Noah. Instead of choosing to fully start over, God stuck with man. Today, Josh and Miles' journey presses onward. Even with Miles' injury, they have managed to scramble out of the canyon they were stuck in and continue to look for civilization. While walking, they have encountered more twists, turns, and climbing. Josh has helped Miles when he has needed it, and Miles has continued to engage with the story Josh is telling. We join them as they have just come around a bend to find an area where some trash has been lying around for years.
Look at this. Come on.
Wow.
Here we are in the middle of nowhere, and man has still left his mark. I mean, everywhere he goes, he destroys, breaks, and ruins this planet. I mean, we can't hope that anyone's around here. That looks like this crap's been here for years.
Wow, I didn't even think they made these anymore.
Looks like that brokenness that we talked about still around. I mean, I know that you said in the story that you were telling that God is trying to restore things, but seriously, he has a lot more work to do. I mean, is he just leaving this mess around until he's done with this world?
Of course not. I don't think God likes these kind of messes any more than you or I do. As we talked about yesterday, he doesn't just choose to leave things as is. He wants to change them, to restore them, to redeem them.
Why does he come down here and clean up this mess himself then? I mean, clearly the flood did not wipe out all the bad stuff in the world. It still exists. Wouldn't it have been easier and quicker if he just came down and took care of this on his own?
I suppose. But, as we saw with the story with Noah, how he enlisted his help, God usually doesn't choose to do this kind of stuff by himself. He wants to partner with people. He wants to partner with people to bring wholeness, to battle brokenness, to work toward restoration. He wants to find people to partner with, to recycle, to redeem. He wants people that will fight with him. You know, I think this brings us to Act 3, if you're ready. I like to call this one resistance.
Resistance? Sounds intriguing.
Oh, it's a good one. All right, so similar to how God called Noah, he chooses to call all of mankind to work with him. And here, as we pick up the story at this point, he calls this man named Abraham.
Tell me about this guy. What's his story?
You want a snack?
Sure.
I think I'm out of food. So God comes to this man named Abraham, and he's settled and content with his little life. But God calls him to greatness. God wants to partner with him, to work with him, to change the world. So he comes to Abraham and he says, I want to make you awesome. I want you to have an incredible life. I want to give you lands and herds and wealth. I want you to have a ridiculous amount of descendants. I want you to be blessed.
Sorry, I thought you said this was about making a difference.
Well, see, it doesn't stop there. God doesn't just say, I want to bless you. He says to him, I want to bless you so that you may be a blessing to others. I think he blesses him for a couple of reasons. The first is that he wants people to know how much he loves them, and that he wants to bless all people. And the second is that he actually wants to bless the world and make a difference through Abraham. God is looking for people that will create great things to bless this world.
You know, you speak about blessing and how God wants to use people to show his love, to bless, to make a difference in this world, to help others. But the reality, as we talked about yesterday, is that more times than not, man chooses to hurt instead of heal.
So what happened was that, starting in Act 2, is that blessing and curse start battling. God has given man this creative power to influence the world. But the problem is that so often man chooses to use this power to hurt and not to heal. He uses it to perpetuate brokenness and not to foster wholeness. He so often chooses to curse and not to bless.
So kind of like, wait a second. I think I understand a little about what you're saying about blessing, but what do you mean by curse?
I think these things can be a little confusing, especially since we so often talk about blessing and cursing in terms of magic or fairy tales. Not to take anything away from the power of these things, but I think it's a lot more mundane than that, than some kind of magic spell where we throw all these things in a pot or something. I think it's equally powerful, but less fanciful. See, to bless would be to promote, to advance, to move forward. Whereas to curse would be to block, to delay, to stand in the way. To bless would be to heal, whereas to curse would be to hurt. To bless would be to create, whereas to curse would be to destroy. To bless would be to help, whereas to curse would be to hinder. To bless would be to stand with, whereas to curse would be to stand against or abandon. To bless would be to build harmony, whereas to curse would be to disrupt it. To bless would be to come to the aid of someone in need, whereas to curse would be to ignore them. To bless would be to encourage or affirm, whereas to curse would be to belittle or tear down.
I got one for you.
All right.
To bless would be to not let the random guy that you just met get hurt. To curse would be to stand there and watch as he falls.
Here we go.
I'm just kidding, Pastor. I know you reached your hand out to try and help me. You can continue.
So God's telling Abraham that he's giving him the means by which he can make a difference in the world. He tells him that I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the resources and the assistance you need to make a difference. I want you to promote, to help, to heal, to stand, to move forward.
So, kind of like a superhero that has to decide whether to use their power for good or evil.
Yeah, I think so. Very much so. You see, God says to Abraham, he says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who curse you. See, there's a bigger picture here. God's telling Abraham that he's going to stand with those who stand with him, and he's going to fight with those who fight against him. God's asking Abraham to be a person to use his creative power to bless and not to curse. So yes, maybe like a superhero. But you see, we see God's recruiting people, but he's not recruiting superheroes. God's recruiting so-called ordinary people. As we talked about yesterday and the day before, God has made these ordinary people in his image, and he's empowered them to co-create with him. He wants these people to join with him, to stand with him. He wants real people to make a difference in this world.
Ordinary. I knew students on my campus that dealt with things like this all the time. I mean, a kid's getting picked on and students walk by and noticed. Now, each of those students had a choice to make. They could continue to walk and pretend like nothing was happening, or they could stop and stand up for the kid getting picked on, even if it means getting picked on themselves, getting beat up, or maybe having their reputation hurt.
That's exactly it. When it comes to evil, pain, shame, hurt, brokenness, and even litter, God is not content with this big mess. He calls for people to make a difference, people that will stand up for others, people that will clean up the trash, literally and metaphorically, people that will bring healing to his people, people that will promote healthy relationships, people that will work to resolve issues, people that will care for their neighbor, and people will fight against the evil that threatens this world.
Man, you sound like a revolution's coming.
It is. That's right. God is sparking a resistance movement against evil. He wants people to join together with him. And in so many ways, the reigning power in this world right now is this oppressive darkness. I mean, it's common to curse. It's natural to hurt. It's normal to think only about ourselves.
I agree.
But God is enlisting people who will join him, people who are willing to stand. He wants people who will opt for healing, people who will encourage wholeness, people who will care for their neighbor, people who will join his ranks and walk with him as he seeks to bring blessing to the world and show the world how deeply he loves them.
It's easier said than done, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think we have a great example of this in the story of a guy named Joseph. Joseph's story starts out great. He's the great-grandson of Abraham. And God's blessing has flown down, and God has kept his promise. Things are good. Now, Joseph is the most favored of all of his many brothers. As they have to go out and work and do hard labor, he gets to stay home and relax with mom and dad. He even gets all these special gifts. Now, of course, his brothers don't like this very much. And over time, they get frustrated, very jealous of him. And it gets to the point where they're ready to kill him.
Kind of like that brother who killed his brother in the story from yesterday.
Yeah. So they're ready to kill him, though, and then they get this better idea. They decide to sell him off as a slave instead.
That's still messed up.
I know, right? As a slave, he's deported into a foreign land, into Egypt. And as if being a slave and a foreigner back then isn't bad enough, through a series of events, he finds himself imprisoned unjustly. Now, fate has not been kind to Joseph. The years pass, though, and things start to turn around. And with God's help, he actually finds himself as the number 2 person in charge of all of Egypt. God has definitely blessed this guy.
Wait, dude goes from being favored son in his family to being sold into slavery by his brothers to being thrown into jail to the number 2 guy in charge of Egypt? No way, man, that's crazy.
God's stories are really crazy sometimes. All these bugs around here, man. But this story gets better. You see, Joseph piles up this huge stockpile of food because God has let him know that there's going to be 7 years of famine. I mean, massive stockpile of food, and the famine hits. And it is bad. It affects Egypt and a large radius all around it. It even reaches Joseph's brothers, who have, of course, taken him for dead at this point. So they head out to Egypt with some money and try and buy food. Hope that this is their last chance. They need food to survive. They get there, and as so many years have passed, and as Joseph is now dressed as this Egyptian ruler, they don't recognize him. But he recognizes them. He holds their future in his hands. And he's got this moment where he can decide their fate.
Done. These brothers are so done. I mean, this is the moment. This is the moment we were talking about earlier. Joseph right now is going to have the choice to bless or to curse, right?
Right. And it's as if everything is pushing him towards cursing. It would be totally natural, almost justified, if he was so angry and bitter that he decided to enact his vengeance upon them at this point. So here, this is his superhero coming-of-age moment, though, where he makes this decision to commit to the resistance movement and to help his brothers. He actually forgives them. He has mercy on them. He takes them in. He gives them more than they even needed and works to rebuild the relationship.
Wow. Joseph's story is pretty powerful. It goes against how people normally act.
Yeah.
I mean, he actually chose to bless instead of curse. I mean, can you tell me a little bit more about this blessing idea?
Yeah. So God is looking for people who will be just and generous and caring and joyful. This piece of the story takes place at a time when people had very few rights, when nations would show no mercy towards one another, and where people were mostly concerned about themselves. Yet God calls people to care for others even when it's inconvenient. He calls them to be generous even when it hurts, to be just even when it's unpopular, to be joyful even when we face storms in life. You see, to bless is to create good in the world even when things are bad. It's to bring healing when people are sick. It's to opt for mercy instead of punishment. This took place in a time when there's no safety nets either. There's no social security. There's no welfare, no job banks. So if you find yourself inconvenienced, you're up a tree. If you're one of the unfortunate ones in society, the vulnerable, who especially are like the orphans, the widows, the immigrants, you've got no support system, no help, no rights. We see, God commissions his people to go against the urge to abandon the marginalized. He calls his people to be a voice for the voiceless, a help for the helpless, a hope for the hopeless. See, because God himself cares so deeply about these people, he wants to see them cared for. He calls people and asks them to go beyond themselves and be his hand of blessing. He asks them to give legs to this resistance movement against evil.
I think I can relate to what you're saying. I mean, I have these students, many of whose parents immigrated from Mexico. And the more that I learned about these students and their families, the more I learned about the problems that they face. Mm-hmm. And I had this student, Matthias. His dad got attacked. He was beaten pretty badly. Now, the family was afraid to call the police for fear of being deported. They're afraid to take him to the emergency room for fear of being able to afford the bill. And after I talked to Matthias a little more, I learned that they barely had enough money to even afford over-the-counter drugs for his pain. And even if they could have, they weren't sure if they'd actually be able to tell the pharmacy the drugs that they needed because of the language barrier. It broke me. I mean, I knew I had to help this family out. I knew I had to at least buy the medicine for them for the pain. You know? As time went on, I learned more and more things from students like this. It built and built and built. The problems grew and grew and grew, even with Matthias' family. I couldn't do more. I wasn't big enough. The problem was too big. I mean, so many of the problems that I see in the world today just seem too big to even try to take on.
You're right. In so many ways, these problems are too big. There is only so much that one man can do. But one man can do something, and that can make a big difference. What you did for that family makes a very real difference in their life.
Not so sure about that.
I imagine that they'll never forget what you did for them. In a time of fear, anxiety, and helplessness, you chose to bless.
But it's just a drop in the bucket. I mean, how many other Matthiases are out there that I'm unable to get to?
But when joined by others, you can make a big impact. Just because the situation is daunting doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something, doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and bless.
Yeah? I guess so. What's that quote? All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Yes.
I mean, that quote's never resonated more with me than right now.
Absolutely. And what's even more important in this story is that those who bless don't journey alone. God walks with them as they work to bring blessing to this world. It's easy to feel alone when we work to make a difference. It's easy to feel ill-prepared, weak, under-resourced. But we do not bless alone. God walks with us. He works with us. He multiplies our efforts. Now, in this same story, there's another example for you. This guy named Moses. Now, we're picking up a few hundred years after the story of Joseph. And at the time, Israel, God's people, Joseph's relatives, find themselves as slaves in Egypt.
Before you talked about one slave. Now you're talking about a people of slaves? I got to hear this. You're walking on thin ice. You best be careful, Pastor.
Actually, I think you're really going to like this part, Miles.
Okay. We'll see about that. Let's hear it.
So the Israelites are in captivity. And God calls this guy Moses. As we pick up the story, we find that he's way outside of Egypt. And he's actually been gone for 40 years because he killed some dude and then ran away.
Man, this story seems to have a lot of killing or talk of killing.
Yeah. But what we see is that a guy comes to him and he calls him. And he says, I want you to go free my people from captivity. Now, Moses, of course, he starts making excuses right away. I can't do that, God. I'm not good enough, God. You want me? Who? No. Do you remember what I did? Do you remember my past? I'm not eloquent enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong enough. He realizes his limitations, just like the ones you mentioned earlier.
Interesting. I always pictured that God used these superhero-type people to do his work. I mean, almost like these angels in disguise, if there is such a thing. I never pictured this story to include normal people that had doubts and fears, that questioned whether they could even help or make a difference.
Well, so God does use this normal guy, and he sends him back to Egypt. And there he meets with the Pharaoh, who's like the king, the dictator, the most powerful guy in the land. And Moses, this messed up guy, goes against the head of the largest superpower of the time. He goes up to him, and he calls him, and he says, I want you to free God's people. Now, the Pharaoh doesn't like this idea, obviously. This is going to destroy their economy. But Moses doesn't journey this alone. He goes up to him, and God starts doing these signs and these miracles and great things. There's this crazy stuff happens. There's these swarms of gnats and flies and frogs galore. There's this wild, crazy hail, darkness all day long, water turning to blood. It's just this unbelievable picture. And then finally, it comes down to this point where God strikes down the firstborn of those that would oppose his people. And so after all of this Pharaoh guy is just fed up, and he gives them permission to leave and sets them free.
That's what I'm talking about, free and clear, finally.
Well, not quite. You see, after they leave, he goes back on his word. He chases after them. He's going after them with his army. And you've got these slaves and women and children, and you've got the greatest army of all time. And they find themselves with their backs up against the wall, up against the sea, really. And on one side, behind them, they've got this massive sea. There's nowhere to go. On the other side, they have this army with all its chariots and warriors. They find themselves cornered and helpless. But then God makes a way where there's no way. In these waters, he parts them, pushes them to the side, and they pass through on dry land. As they get to the other side, they're probably still terrified because the Egyptian army comes in after them. But then what happens is that God collapses the waters down on those that would oppose those he so dearly loves. He protects them. And finally, they are free.
Let freedom reign, man. I can relate to these people.
You see, there's no way this Moses guy could have done it himself. The problem was just too big. But because he's willing to answer the call, God journeys with him. God empowers him. How many times must there have been where he said, this is just insane? Where it was just absurd what he was doing, where the problem was too big, it was too much. Where he had no right or ability even trying to do any of this. But what God does is he fills in the gaps where Moses isn't strong enough. And there were quite a few of those. In fact, almost none of this would happen if God isn't walking with Moses. But at the same time, if Moses doesn't leap, if he doesn't follow God's call, it doesn't happen either. See, God blesses him so that he can bless millions of people.
It's really great. But I still can't let go of the fact that people are hurting each other all the time still. I mean, attacking each other, abandoning each other, being bitter towards each other. I mean, there still seems to be so many issues in the world today.
Yeah, there are. And that's why God is looking for people who will fight for good, who will retain his image, who will create positive things, who will clean up the messes of the world. People who will see beyond themselves and care for others. Do you even know what you've been doing?
What?
You're picking up trash. You're cleaning up the mess. You're restoring this area. You're choosing to bless, my friend.
I am.
You see, this is where this isn't just a story in a book somewhere. This is where the story comes alive. Where it leaps off the page. Where this story, we realize it's also reality. See, God doesn't just call these historical figures Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. God is still calling for people today who will choose to bless those around them. He is looking for a people that will make a difference in the world. He's enlisting people like you and me to change the world. He is leading a resistance.